What would you do if the people you trusted most hid a betrayal so deep it threatened everything you stood for? Sheriff Malachi Carter thought he knew his family, his wife, and his own blood, until a simple DNA test shattered his reality. As secrets from the past resurface and loyalties are tested, how far can a man go before justice turns into revenge? Malachi Carter prided himself on the life he had built. A respectable career as the sheriff of Pine Creek, a small but bustling southern town, and a family that radiated warmth and stability. He had married Naomi, a charismatic and graceful woman who had quickly become the heart of the town's social circles. She was the type of person who remembered everyone's birthdays, brought meals to grieving families, and chaired every community fundraiser with effortless charm. Together, they had 3 beautiful children, 2 boisterous boys, Elijah and Caleb, and their youngest, a thoughtful girl named Kyra. To the outside world, they were the perfect family. Malachi was a steady and reliable man, deeply respected by his peers and beloved by his community. Naomi's warmth was the glue that held their family together, balancing Malachi's often serious demeanor with her vibrant energy. But like most seemingly perfect families, they had their secrets. One of those secrets came knocking on Malachi's door one muggy summer afternoon. His younger half-brother, Darren, stood on the porch, his hands shoved into the pockets of his worn-out jeans, a crooked grin on his face. Darren had always been the black sheep of the family, a rebellious, free-spirited musician who left town nearly a decade ago in pursuit of big-city dreams that never materialized. When those dreams crumbled, Darren drifted from one city to another, chasing fleeting opportunities and leaving behind a string of broken relationships. Malachi, ever the protector, couldn't turn him away. Family was family, no matter how flawed. "Come on in," Malachi said, stepping aside to let Darren into the home. Naomi appeared in the doorway of the living room, her expression a mix of surprise and something Malachi couldn't quite place, something fleeting that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Darren," she said, her voice measured yet warm. "It's been a long time." "It has," Darren replied, his gaze lingering on her a moment too long. Malachi didn't notice. He was too busy outlining his plans to help Darren get back on his feet. "You'll stay with us," Malachi said firmly. "We've got the guest room, and I can help you find some work around town. It's time to settle down, man. Get your life together." Naomi didn't object. She smiled, her usual radiant smile, and welcomed Darren into their home. But later that night, as Malachi sat in his recliner reviewing case files, he noticed Naomi was quieter than usual. She sat across from him, staring out the window with a glass of wine in her hand, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of the glass. "You okay?" Malachi asked, glancing up from his work. She startled slightly, as though pulled from a distant thought. "Yeah," she said, offering a faint smile. "Just tired. Long day." Malachi didn't press further. He chalked it up to the stress of hosting a guest and went back to his files. But for Naomi, Darren's presence was like a ghost resurrected from a past she had buried long ago. Years before she had met Malachi, she and Darren had crossed paths at a music festival. Back then, Darren was everything she thought she wanted: wild, passionate, and untethered. They had a brief but fiery fling, one she hadn't thought much about until she met Malachi a year later and fell in love with his steadiness and integrity. She had told herself that Darren was nothing more than a youthful mistake, a fleeting chapter that had no bearing on her new life. She hadn't expected to ever see him again, and when Malachi introduced her to Darren as his half-brother shortly before their wedding, she had been so stunned she could barely breathe. She remembered plastering on a smile, shaking Darren's hand, and praying he wouldn't say anything to Malachi. He didn't. Darren had simply given her a knowing look, one she hadn't been able to forget. Now, with Darren under their roof, That chapter of her life felt dangerously close to being reopened. In the weeks that followed, Malachi did his best to help Darren adjust to life in Pine Creek. He got him a job at a local hardware store and invited him to family dinners and barbecues. Darren, for his part, played the role of the reformed man, charming everyone with his wit and humor. The kids adored him, especially Elijah, who saw Darren's guitar skills as the coolest thing ever. But behind closed doors, the tension between Darren and Naomi was palpable. Darren made subtle comments when they were alone, mentions of the past, remarks about how life had turned out. Naomi tried to brush them off, but the memories they stirred made it harder and harder to keep her composure. One evening, as Naomi stood in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner, Darren leaned against the counter, watching her. "You've done well for yourself," he said, his voice low. "Don't," Naomi replied, not looking up from the dishes. "Don't what?" Darren asked innocently, though there was a teasing edge to his tone. "I'm just saying you've built a nice life. Beautiful house, great kids, perfect husband." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Almost makes you forget about the past, doesn't it?" Naomi froze, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. She turned to face him, her eyes flashing with anger. "I made my choice, Darren, a long time ago. Whatever happened back then doesn't matter anymore." Darren smirked. "Doesn't matter to who? You or Malachi?" Naomi opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of Malachi's footsteps approaching. She quickly turned back to the sink, scrubbing a plate with more force than necessary. Darren straightened up and plastered on a casual smile just as Malachi entered the room. "What's going on in here?" Malachi asked, glancing between the two of them. "Just chatting," Darren said easily. "Catching up on old times." Naomi didn't say a word. As the weeks turned into months, Naomi's resolve began to crack. Darren's presence was a constant reminder of a version of herself she had worked so hard to leave behind. And Darren, ever the instigator, seemed to take pleasure in testing her limits, finding small ways to insert himself into her life. One night, while Malachi was working late, Darren cornered Naomi in the living room. "Why do you keep pretending this isn't still there?" he asked, his voice low and insistent. "Because it's not," Naomi snapped, though her voice trembled. "It is," Darren said, stepping closer. "You feel it. I know you do." Naomi backed away, shaking her head. "You need to stop. This has to stop." Darren didn't press further that night, but the damage was done. Naomi's carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble, and she could feel it slipping through her fingers. Meanwhile, Malachi remained oblivious, too focused on his duties as sheriff to notice the storm brewing in his own home. But the cracks in his family's foundation were growing wider, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Malachi had always trusted his instincts. They were what made him an excellent sheriff. But when it came to his family, his instincts faltered. He didn't want to believe that something was wrong. Yet, over the weeks, he began noticing subtle changes in Naomi and Darren's behavior. Naomi, once the steady anchor of their home, seemed distracted. She avoided his eyes during conversations. Her laughter sounded forced, and she grew unusually defensive when he asked simple questions. Darren, on the other hand, had become overly helpful, almost too eager to win Malachi's approval. It was the little things that gnawed at Malachi, a shared glance between them that lingered too long, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered the room, and the tension that seemed to hang in the air whenever the three of them were together. At first, Malachi told himself he was imagining it. He'd seen too much infidelity in his line of work and didn't want to project those fears onto his own family. But one evening, as he was heading to bed, he overheard a muffled argument coming from the living room. He stopped halfway up the stairs, straining to hear. "I told you this isn't the time," Naomi hissed. "You can't keep running from this. Darren replied, his voice low but sharp. It's not just your secret to keep. Malachi's chest tightened. He stepped back into the shadows, not wanting them to know he was listening. Their voices grew softer, and he couldn't make out the rest of the conversation. That night, as Naomi lay beside him in bed, her back turned, Malachi stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. The next morning, he began his investigation. Malachi started small, reviewing old photographs and timelines in his mind. He remembered when he had first introduced Naomi to Darren, just before their wedding. She had seemed nervous at the time, but he'd chalked it up to wedding jitters. Now, he revisited that memory with a growing unease. Using his access to town records, Malachi began digging into Naomi's past, cross-referencing dates and locations she'd mentioned in casual conversations over the years. It didn't take long for inconsistencies to emerge. Naomi had told him she first moved to Pine Creek for a teaching job shortly before they met, but he discovered she'd been living in the neighboring county for nearly a year prior. And during that time, Darren had been living there too. His heart pounded as he processed this revelation. Could it be a coincidence? Or had they known each other all along? The final straw came when Malachi stumbled upon an old photograph in Darren's belongings. It was a grainy snapshot of Naomi and Darren at what appeared to be a music festival. They were standing close, Naomi's arm draped around Darren's shoulders, both of them smiling in a way that felt too intimate for mere acquaintances. The date scrawled on the back of the photo confirmed it had been taken a year before Malachi and Naomi met. Malachi felt a knot of anger and betrayal tightening in his chest, but he kept his emotions in check. He needed proof, undeniable evidence, before he confronted either of them. Malachi decided to conduct DNA tests on his children. It wasn't an easy decision, but the seeds of doubt had been planted, and he couldn't ignore them any longer. He collected samples discreetly, using the pretense of a school science project to swab the kids' cheeks. He sent the samples to a private lab, ensuring that no one in Pine Creek would catch wind of his investigation. The results arrived 2 weeks later. Malachi sat alone in his office at the sheriff's station, the unopened envelope resting heavily in his hands. For a moment, he considered tossing it into the trash and pretending none of this had ever happened. But his curiosity and his duty to the truth won out. He tore open the envelope and scanned the results. The words jumped off the page. Asterisk. Exclusion of biological relationship. The test confirmed his worst fear. None of the children were biologically his. Malachi's hands trembled as he reread the report, hoping he'd missed something. But the results were clear. The children he had loved, raised, and sacrificed for were not his. A mix of anger, heartbreak, and confusion overwhelmed him. How could Naomi have done this? How long had she been lying to him? He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he went home that evening and tried to act normal, though his eyes lingered on his children with a newfound heaviness. They were still his children in every way that mattered, but the betrayal cut deep. Malachi finally confronted Naomi late one night after the kids had gone to bed. He laid the DNA results on the kitchen table and crossed his arms, staring at her with an intensity that made her shrink in her chair. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low but laced with anger. Naomi's eyes widened as she read the results. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Tell me the truth," Malachi said, his voice breaking. "Whose kids are they?" Naomi broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm so sorry, Malachi," she choked out. "I never meant for you to find out this way." "Oh," he pressed, his patience thinning. "Is it Darren?" Naomi shook her head vehemently. "No, it's not Darren. It's—" She hesitated, as if saying the name aloud would make it real. "Oh," Malachi demanded again. "It's Jacob," Naomi whispered. Malachi froze, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. Jacob Carter, his estranged father. The man who had walked out on their family when Malachi was just a boy, leaving his mother to pick up the pieces. the man Malachi had sworn to never forgive. "What do you mean it's Jacob?" Malachi asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi wiped her tears and looked at him with haunted eyes. "Before I met you, I was in a relationship with him. It wasn't something I wanted, Malachi. He was older, manipulative, and I didn't know how to get out of it." Malachi staggered back, as if her words had physically struck him. "He pressured me, Malachi," Naomi continued, her voice trembling. "And by the time I realized who he really was, it was too late. I was pregnant. When I met you, you were everything he wasn't. Kind, steady, a good man. I didn't want to lose that, so I never told you." Malachi felt like the ground beneath him had disappeared. His wife, his children, his entire life. It all felt like a cruel joke. As if the truth wasn't devastating enough, Naomi dropped another bombshell. "Darren knew," she admitted. "What?" Malachi's voice was sharp, his anger now directed at his brother. "He figured it out years ago," Naomi said. "When he came back to town, he threatened to tell you everything unless I gave him what he wanted." Malachi's jaw clenched as he pieced it together. Darren's sudden return, his charm offensive, his manipulative behavior. It had all been part of his plan to exploit Naomi's secret. "You should have told me," Malachi said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I was scared," Naomi replied. "I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want to lose everything." Malachi had always been a man of restraint. In his years as sheriff, he'd been faced with high-stakes situations that demanded calm and clarity. But nothing, no amount of training or experience, could have prepared him for the betrayal he uncovered within his own home. The weight of Naomi's confession sat heavy in his chest, a festering wound that refused to heal. After days of silence, during which Malachi barely spoke to Naomi or Darren, he returned home one evening to find the house eerily quiet. The kids were staying with a neighbor for the night, and the only sound was the faint murmur of voices coming from the backyard. Curiosity and suspicion propelled Malachi forward. As he stepped outside, the sight before him made his blood boil. Naomi and Darren stood near the edge of the porch, locked in a heated argument. Darren's posture was aggressive, his arms gesturing wildly, while Naomi seemed defensive, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You promised me," Darren's voice carried across the yard. "You said you'd keep this between us." "I didn't have a choice, Darren," Naomi hissed back. "He found out. What was I supposed to do? Lie to him forever?" "Yes," Darren shot back. "You should have kept your mouth shut. Now look what you've done. He's going to ruin everything." Malachi's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. The sound made both Naomi and Darren whip their heads toward him. "Ruin everything?" Malachi said, his voice low and menacing. "You mean ruin your little scheme?" Darren stiffened, his bravado fading slightly under Malachi's intense glare. "Malachi, I can explain." "Don't," Malachi interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He turned to Naomi, his eyes filled with a mix of hurt and anger. "How long were you going to keep this from me? Or were you waiting for Darren to finish tearing apart what's left of our family?" Naomi opened her mouth to speak, but Darren interjected. "Don't blame her for this," he said, stepping closer to Malachi. "She's not the one who's been blind this whole time." Malachi's jaw tightened. He could feel the anger bubbling just beneath the surface, threatening to spill over. "Blind?" he said, his voice shaking. "You think I'm blind? I see everything now. The lies, the manipulation, the betrayal. You don't know the half of it," Darren said with a smirk, his tone dripping with arrogance. That was the breaking point. In an instant, years of pent-up frustration and betrayal boiled over. Malachi lunged at Darren, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wooden post of the porch. Darren struggled, trying to break free, but Malachi's grip was unrelenting. "You've been playing me for a fool," Malachi growled, his face inches from Darren's. "In my house, around my children. How dare you? Get your hands off me." Darren spat, shoving Malachi in an attempt to escape. But the shove only fueled Malachi's fury. Naomi screamed, rushing forward to intervene. "Stop it! Both of you, stop!" But neither man listened. The fight escalated, turning into a full-blown brawl. Malachi's fists connected with Darren's face, the sound of bone against bone echoing in the night. Darren fought back, landing a punch that split Malachi's lip, but he was no match for his brother's strength and rage. In the chaos, Darren reached for a nearby gardening tool, a heavy metal rake. He swung it wildly, narrowly missing Malachi's head. The weapon clattered to the ground as Malachi wrestled it away, his vision red with fury. "You think you can come into my home and destroy everything I've worked for?" Malachi shouted, his voice hoarse with emotion. Before he could process what was happening, Malachi swung the rake with all his might. The metal prongs connected with Darren's temple, sending him sprawling to the ground. He didn't move. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Malachi stared at Darren's lifeless body, his chest heaving as the weight of what he'd done began to sink in. "Malachi!" Naomi's voice broke through the haze. She dropped to her knees beside Darren, her hands trembling as she checked for a pulse. "What have you done?" "He deserved it," Malachi muttered, his voice devoid of emotion. Naomi looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "You didn't have to kill him." Malachi's gaze hardened. "After everything he's done, he doesn't deserve to live." Naomi stood, her fear giving way to anger. "You're no better than him if you think killing is the answer." The argument reignited, their voices rising in the still night air. Naomi tried to grab the rake from Malachi, her desperation fueling her actions. In the struggle, Malachi lost his grip, and the tool fell to the ground. But the fight wasn't over. Naomi pushed against Malachi's chest, her strength surprising him. "You've destroyed everything," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "Our family, our lives, everything." Malachi stumbled backward, his foot catching on the edge of the porch. He regained his balance, just as Naomi lunged at him again. In the heat of the moment, Malachi shoved her away, harder than he intended. Naomi fell backward, her head striking the sharp edge of the wooden steps. The sound was sickening, a dull thud followed by silence. Malachi froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Naomi," he whispered, stepping toward her. She didn't respond. Panic set in. Malachi knelt beside Naomi, shaking her gently. Her eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, and she whispered something he couldn't quite hear before her body went limp. Tears streamed down Malachi's face as he cradled her lifeless form. How had it come to this? How had everything spiraled so far out of control? In that moment, Malachi made a decision born of desperation and self-preservation. He couldn't let his children grow up without their father. He couldn't let the town see him as a murderer. He staged the scene to make it look like Darren had attacked Naomi in a fit of rage and that Malachi had acted in self-defense. He placed the rake in Darren's hand, positioning the bodies to tell a story that absolved him of blame. When everything was set, he called 911, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "There's been an attack at my house," he said. "My wife and brother. I tried to stop him, but it was too late." As the sirens wailed in the distance, Malachi sat on the porch, his hands stained with blood and his heart heavy with guilt. He knew the truth would haunt him for the rest of his life, but he told himself it was for the greater good, for his children, for his reputation, for the town he had sworn to protect. But deep down, he knew there would be no escape from the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was packed. Every pew-like bench was filled with townspeople, reporters, and curious onlookers who wanted to witness the trial of Sheriff Malachi Carter, a man who had once been the symbol of justice, now accused of double murder. Malachi sat at the defense table, his face stoic, but his mind a whirlwind. He had maintained his version of events. Darren attacked Naomi in a fit of rage, and Malachi intervened to save her. The physical evidence seemed to align, and his lawyer had done an admirable job casting doubt on any alternate theories. The prosecution, however, had built a strong case against him. They painted a picture of a man whose jealousy and rage drove him to commit unspeakable acts. But without a smoking gun, a clear piece of evidence that disproved Malachi's claims, it seemed possible he might walk free. Then came the moment no one saw coming. The prosecutor called their next witness, Kyra Carter, Malachi's 15-year-old daughter. Kyra hesitated as she entered the courtroom, her steps slow and uncertain. She wore a simple dress, her long hair tied back, and her face was pale. Her eyes, wide and filled with a mix of fear and determination, scanned the room until they landed on her father. For a fleeting moment, their gazes locked, and something unspoken passed between them. Malachi's chest tightened. He hadn't expected Kyra to testify. In fact, he had specifically told his lawyer that his children were off limits. What could she possibly say? After being sworn in, Kyra sat on the witness stand, her hands gripping the edges of the wooden armrests. The prosecutor approached her with a kind smile, but Kyra's eyes remained fixed on her lap. Kyra, the prosecutor began gently, I know this is difficult for you, but can you tell us about the night of the incident? Kyra nodded slowly, her voice trembling as she spoke. I was upstairs in my room, she said. I wasn't asleep. I heard yelling. The courtroom grew eerily silent. Every creak, cough, and rustle ceased as the audience leaned forward, hanging on her every word. Who was yelling? The prosecutor asked. Uncle Darren and my mom, Kyra replied. Then I heard Dad's voice. He was shouting too. I couldn't make out everything they were saying, but they sounded really angry. The prosecutor nodded, her tone calm and encouraging. What happened next? Kyra hesitated, her eyes darting toward her father. Malachi's expression remained unreadable, but she could see the tension in his jaw. I heard fighting, Kyra continued, her voice barely above a whisper. It sounded like someone fell. Then it got quiet for a moment. After that, I heard Dad talking to Mom. Do you remember what he said? Kyra bit her lip, tears welling in her eyes. He said he killed Uncle Darren because he deserved it. He wasn't trying to save Mom. He was getting revenge. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Malachi's lawyer shot up from his seat. Objection, Your Honor, he exclaimed. This testimony is speculative and unreliable. The judge raised a hand, silencing the room. Overruled. The witness may continue. Malachi's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to stand up, to tell Kyra to stop, to protect her from the weight of what she was doing. But he was frozen, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Kyra, the prosecutor said softly, are you absolutely certain of what you heard? Kyra nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, he said it. And then Mom begged him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. The prosecutor paused, letting the weight of Kyra's words settle over the room. She turned to face the jury, her expression grave. No further questions, Your Honor. Malachi's lawyer attempted to cross-examine Kyra, but her testimony remained consistent. She had no reason to lie, and the raw emotion in her voice was impossible to ignore. Kyra's testimony was the final blow to Malachi's defense. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. When the sentence was announced, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Malachi felt a strange sense of relief. The fight was over. He wouldn't have to lie anymore. wouldn't have to maintain the facade. But the relief was fleeting, replaced by an overwhelming wave of guilt and regret. Months later, Kyra visited Malachi in prison. She was older now, her once youthful face hardened by the ordeal. She sat across from him in the sterile visitation room, the thick glass separating them a stark reminder of how much had changed. "I didn't want to testify," Kyra said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "But I couldn't lie for you. I couldn't pretend everything was okay when it wasn't." Malachi nodded slowly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I know," he said quietly. "You did the right thing." Kyra's eyes searched his face, looking for some sign of the father she once knew. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Malachi's gaze dropped to the table. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I regret a lot of things," he said, but he didn't elaborate, and Kyra didn't press him. She stood, her chair scraping against the floor, and turned to leave. As she walked away, Malachi watched her through the glass, his heart breaking all over again. He had lost everything: his family, his freedom, his reputation. And the worst part was knowing it was his own choices that had brought him to this point. The town never fully recovered from the scandal. Malachi's name, once synonymous with justice, became a cautionary tale. Naomi and Darren were buried side by side, their graves a silent reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. As for Kyra, she moved away, determined to build a life untainted by the shadows of her family's past. But the memories lingered, a constant reminder of the night her world fell apart. And Malachi? He spent his days in the confines of a prison cell, haunted by the choices he made and the lives he destroyed. Some stories don't have happy endings. This was one of them. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest content. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let us know what you think. Thanks again for your support, and we'll see you in the next video.